November 1870, the Laramie Valley, Wyoming Territory. A blade of wind, forged in the high peaks, screamed across the high, empty plains, carrying the first stinging needles of snow. It was a wind that didn't just blow around things. It seemed to penetrate them, to find every crack in the land and in the structures men had dared to build upon it. Inside his newly chinked log cabin, Elias Thorne listened to that wind and tasted it. The air was thick with the acrid bite of pine smoke, a ghostly grey cloud that hung in the rafters and burned his eyes. He was a man in his early 40s, with a farmer's solid build, but the harsh Wyoming climate had already carved deep lines into his face. He sat on a low stool, staring at the heart of his home, the fireplace, with a cold, rising sense of dread. The fire itself was a sullen, struggling thing. It was built in a massive, deep hearth of fieldstone, a black cavern that was supposed to radiate life and warmth. Instead, it seemed to be fighting a losing battle. With every powerful gust that struck the cabin's west wall, the wind would find its way down the wide stone chimney, and the fire would answer with a choking puff, belching a cloud of smoke back into the single room, along with a wave of frigid air. His wife, Sarah, turned from where she was kneading dough, her eyes red and watering. She gave a small, dry cough, a sound that cut Elias deeper than the wind. "It's that cottonwood, Elias," she said, her voice strained. "It's still green." Elias shook his head, though he didn't look away from the fire. "It ain't the wood," he said, his voice low. He'd cut and split that wood himself, stacked it high through the dry summer. "It's the wind. It's in the chimney." He had built this cabin just as his father had taught him back in Ohio, log by log, with a chimney wide enough for a man to stand in. "A big fire needs a big mouth," his father had always said. But Ohio didn't have this wind. This wind was a living entity, a predator, and it had found the cabin's weakness. The granite hearthstone at his feet, a massive grey slab he and his ox had dragged for 2 miles from the riverbed, was the symbolic center of their claim. He had set it with pride. Now it was stained with soot, and an hour after the fire was lit, remained icily cold to the touch. The heat was not coming out into the room. It was being stolen, sucked up the flue along with a river of cold air, pulled from every crack in the cabin walls. The cabin was not a refuge. It was a smokehouse, a trap. Elias watched the lazy, sputtering flames, consuming wood faster than he could possibly replenish it, and giving back almost nothing. Winter had not even truly begun, and he already felt its cold fingers on his neck. He knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut that the design everyone used, the design he had trusted, was fundamentally wrong. And he knew that if he didn't find a new way, that cold hearthstone would one day be his family's marker. The failure of the hearth was not just a discomfort, it was a betrayal. Elias had spent the entire summer and fall of 1870 raising the cabin, racing against the approaching winter. He had felled the lodgepole pines himself, skidded them with his single ox, and meticulously saddle-notched each corner. He had followed the common wisdom to the letter. His neighbor, Silas Croft, a man who had come west a year before, had helped him raise the chimney. "You build it on the outside," Silas had instructed, gesturing with his pipe. "That way it don't take up room inside, and if it catches fire, it don't burn the whole cabin down with it." It made sense. So they had built it that way, a massive rough stone chimney clinging to the outer log wall, its structure completely exposed to the elements. The firebox itself was a cavern, nearly 5 feet wide and 4 feet deep, built of heavy uncut river stone. The logic was simple. A big box holds big logs, and big logs make a big fire. The flue above it was just a straight, wide, squared-off hole, rough-lined with a clay and ash mortar, rising 20 feet. There was no damper, no thought given to the shape of the opening. It was, as his father would have said, a good, honest chimney, but its honesty was brutal. From the first fire, it had been a disappointment. It demanded a huge amount of wood just to get a blaze going, and even then, the heat seemed to travel straight up, leaving the far corners of the cabin freezing. The drafts were relentless. The fire sucked air from every gap, under the door, between the new chinked logs, even through the latch hole. Sitting anywhere but directly in front of the blaze meant shivering in a constant invisible river of cold air. But the true test, the moment of near catastrophe, came in late January of 1871. A blue norther swept down from the mountains, a pressure wave of Arctic air that dropped the temperature 40 degrees in an hour. The wind didn't just howl, it shrieked. Elias had stuffed the great fireplace with his best, driest pitch pine, desperate to build a bulwark of heat against the killing cold. The fire roared, a column of yellow flame, and then the wind struck the chimney top. It was not a puff of smoke this time. It was an explosion, a massive column of frigid air, a downdraft of impossible force, plunged down the wide flue. It struck the fire like a physical blow, atomizing the blaze. A roiling, opaque cloud of black smoke, hot ash, and glowing embers blasted out into the room, instantly blinding Elias and Sarah. The cabin filled with toxic, choking smoke in seconds. Sarah screamed, grabbing their 2-year-old son Jacob from his cradle. Elias, blinded and gagging, his lungs on fire, stumbled toward the door. He ripped the latch open, and the blizzard itself screamed into the cabin, a horizontal wall of white. But it was that or suffocate. For nearly an hour they huddled by the open door, the wind and snow filling the room, until the smoke thinned enough for Elias to beat out the embers that had begun to smolder in Sarah's sewing basket. They spent the rest of that night and the next day huddled in their blankets, the fire dead. The cold was so profound it felt like a physical weight. Elias stared at the black, cavernous hole in his wall, now a gateway for the Arctic. This was not a fireplace. It was a weapon pointed at his own family. The common wisdom was a lie. It was designed for a different world, a world without this wind, without this cold. He realized he wasn't just fighting the weather, he was fighting the very design of his own survival. The breaking point had been reached. The cabin had survived the winter, but only just. Elias and Sarah had lived as invalids, moving their bed as close to the hearth as they dared, sleeping in shifts to feed the inefficient fire, their throats raw, their possessions permanently stained with a film of soot. By the thaw of 1871, Elias was a man obsessed. He left the spring planting to Sarah and traveled the 20 miles to the new railroad depot, a raw, sprawling camp of tents and half-built shacks. He wasn't looking for supplies, he was looking for an answer. He found it in a man named Jacob Hess. Hess was an old German, a stonemason who had come to America decades earlier and had followed the railroad west, building roundhouses and footings. He was in his 60s, with hands like gnarled oak roots and eyes that seemed to have seen every kind of stone and every kind of fool. Elias found him living not in a tent, but in a small, neat dugout he had carved into the side of a ravine, its front walled up with meticulous stone and clay. The most remarkable thing, Elias noted as he was invited in, was the air. It was warm, deeply, evenly warm, and it was clean. There was no fire to be seen, only a massive, beautiful column of green glazed tiles in the corner. Hess saw him looking. "A Katchelofen!" the old man said, his voice a low rumble. "A tile stove from the old country. It holds the heat. The fire is very small, but it burns all day. You Americans, you build bonfires inside your houses. You think fire is heat. Fire is just fire. The stone is the heat." Elias, humbled, sat on a low bench and described his problem. He spoke of the deep hearth, the outside chimney, the choking smoke, and the terrifying explosive downdraft. Hess listened patiently, tamping tobacco into a small clay pipe. He lit it, the smoke rising in a perfect thin blue line. "Ja," Hess said at last, exhaling, "you build a barn for your fire, so the wolves come in." He held up his pipe. "Air," he said, "is a river. It wants to go where it is led, but it is also a horse. It is lazy. It must be persuaded. And the wind—" He tapped the stone wall of his dugout. "The wind is a wolf. It seeks the path of least resistance. You have given it a highway." Over the next 2 hours, using a piece of charcoal on a pine board, Hess drew. He didn't draw a fireplace. He drew a machine for managing air. "Your firebox," he sketched a large square, "is too big, too deep. The heat is lost. It goes up. It goes into the cold stones of your outside wall. It is wasted." He sketched again, this time a firebox that was shallow, and whose side walls were not square, but angled, splayed outward. The fire must be small, and it must be pushed into the room. These walls, he tapped the angled lines, are mirrors for heat. The heat cannot hide in the corners. It is radiant. It must be thrown out. Then he drew the key. "The throat, your opening to the chimney. It is a big, stupid hole. The cold air from the top, the downdraft, it falls right in. It has nowhere else to go." He sketched a new design. Just above the firebox, he drew a flat ledge, a shelf that stuck out into the flue. Right in front of it, he drew the opening for the smoke, but it was no longer a big hole. It was a narrow, wide slot. "This," he tapped the shelf, "is the Rauchfangplatte, the smoke shelf. The wolf, the cold air, it falls, it hits the shelf. Thump. It cannot go into your room. It is trapped. It meets the hot smoke coming from the fire, and it is bounced back up. The hot smoke," he tapped the narrow slot, "is fast. It is a jet. It does not wait. It does not wander. It shoots up the chimney. A strong updraft is your only soldier against the wind." Elias stared at the drawing, a feeling of profound, almost religious clarity washing over him. It wasn't about a bigger fire. It was about control. It was about shape and velocity. He returned to his claim a new man. He stopped just outside his cabin, looking not at the logs, but at the wind, watching how it curled around the corner of the stable. He saw the invisible currents Hess had described. He looked at his axe, leaning against the woodpile. He had built his house. Now he had to build a machine. "I'm tearing the chimney down," he told Sarah that night. She looked at him as if he were mad. "Elias, it's nearly June. The planting doesn't matter if we freeze in December," he said, his hand resting on the cold granite hearthstone. "I know what's wrong. I know how to fix it." Elias Thorne spent the next week not in labor, but in thought. He sat at his rough-hewn table, the cabin door open to the mild spring air, and sketched on the back of a tattered freight bill. He was no longer just a farmer. He was an engineer. He was designing a system, and every part had to solve a specific problem. His mind raced, replaying Jakob Hess's words, connecting them to the physics of his own lived failure. First, the problem of downdrafts and smoke. The solution was the smoke shelf and the narrow throat. Hess had been clear. The shelf must be flat and deep enough to act as a dam, and the throat must be a smooth, precise slot, no more than 4 inches deep, to accelerate the hot gas. This was the impossible trick that would tame the wind. Second, the problem of heat inefficiency. His old firebox was a cave. The heat died in it. The new one would be, as Hess advised, shallow and splayed. He would chisel the firestones himself, angling the sidewalls at a precise 30 degrees and leaning the fire back forward to throw the radiant heat into the room. But he had a new idea, one that went beyond Hess's advice. The old chimney was outside, bleeding its warmth into the Wyoming wind. He would build the new one inside. It would rise through the very center of the cabin, a massive 4-foot square column of stone. The fireplace would face the main room, and the stone mass itself would act as a thermal battery. It would soak up the fire's waste heat, the heat that normally escaped up the flue, and then radiate that warmth back into the cabin for hours, long after the fire was embers. This was a radical change, repositioning the entire geography of their lives. Third, the problem of cold drafts. His old fire was an air-starved beast, sucking freezing air from every crack. He would give the fire its own air. He designed a small, stone-lined vent, a fresh air inlet that would run from the outside under the cabin's dirt floor and terminate directly at the side of the hearth. The fire would breathe this cold outside air, leaving the warm air inside the cabin undisturbed. It would become a closed system. The constraints were crushing. He had no new materials, only the pile of soot-stained river stone from the old chimney. He had no trained help. Silas Croft, his neighbor, had stopped by, seen Elias's drawings, and shaken his head. "That ain't a chimney, Elias. It's a bread oven, and it's in the middle of the room. Where's the table go? You're chasing a ghost." Elias ignored him. The mockery only hardened his resolve. His tools were few: a heavy sledge, a set of worn chisels, a trowel he'd forged himself, and his irreplaceable axe for cutting the new roof supports. His timeline was the shortening days. He had to tear down the old chimney, dig a new foundation inside the house, build the entire stone tower, and patch the roof before the first snow, which could come as early as September. The cabin would be a chaotic, stone-filled construction site all summer. Sarah, seeing the focused, almost feverish light in his eyes, finally nodded. "If you know it's right, Elias," she said, "then do it." He spent one last evening staring at the cold, black hole of the old fireplace. He thought of the winter, the smoke, the fear. Then he took his sledgehammer and swung it at the mortar. The first crack of the impact was a sound of finality. There was no going back. The next day, he began to dig the new foundation in the center of their home. The summer of 1871 was a season of controlled demolition and meticulous construction. The cabin was transformed. Where their table had once stood, there was now a gaping 4-foot square pit dug into the hard-packed earth. Elias began by laying the foundation for his stone tower, a heavy base of the largest, flattest rocks, mortared with a stiff mix of river clay, sand, and wood ash. Simultaneously, He dug the trench for his fresh air inlet, a 6-inch wide channel, which he lined with flat stones to create a durable underground pipe. This channel ran from the new foundation pit under the floor and exited through the cabin's foundation wall, where he covered the opening with a piece of punched tin to keep out rodents. This task alone, digging and building inside his own home, took a week of backbreaking labor. Sarah and young Jacob moved their lives to the corners of the room, cooking on an outside fire pit, living amidst the dust and chaos. Then the tower began to rise. Elias meticulously cleaned every stone from the old chimney, chipping away the black, crumbling mortar. He laid each stone with a mason's care, building the massive square column up from the pit. This was not the rough, hurried work of the previous year. This was slow, patient, and precise. The stones had to fit perfectly. The mass had to be solid, with no air gaps to function as his thermal battery. The cabin filled with the rhythmic chink, chink, chink of his hammer and chisel. Neighbors who stopped by saw not a chimney, but what looked like a stone fortress being erected in the middle of a home. They left, whispering that Thorn had finally lost his mind to the wind. The most critical part of the construction was the firebox itself. At hearth level, Elias stopped building the solid column and began to shape the machine. He did not build a deep cave. The firebox was shockingly shallow, only 20 inches deep. Using his chisel, he painstakingly shaped the firestones. The back wall was not vertical. It leaned forward, from the base to the top, designed to reflect heat out into the room. The side walls were not parallel. They were splayed at a sharp angle, like the inside of a megaphone. Every piece was angled to bounce radiant heat forward, toward the granite hearthstone he had not yet set. Then came the impossible part, the mechanism that Hess had sketched. Above the firebox, Elias built the smoke shelf. It was a flat ledger of stone, extending nearly 1.5 feet behind the flue opening. It was the dam for the wind. Directly in front of this shelf, he formed the throat. It was not a gaping hole. It was a perfectly smooth, narrow slot, running the full width of the firebox, but only 4 inches deep from front to back. He lined this throat with his smoothest, flattest stones, creating a venturi to accelerate the smoke. Above this complex assembly, he continued the flue, a square, smooth-walled vertical shaft, encased now within the tons of stone that formed the central tower. Finally, he cut a hole in his roof ridge, reinforcing it with new timbers, and the chimney topped out, a solid, defiant square of stone against the blue sky. As a last step, he took the original, cold granite hearthstone, cleaned it of its soot, and set it perfectly in place at the mouth of his new, shallow, intelligent fireplace. He mixed the last of his mortar and laid a final, clean bead around its edge. He was done. It was late August. The nights were already cold. The cabin was dominated by this monolith of stone. It was either a triumph or a catastrophic folly. He stacked a small pyramid of kindling inside the new firebox, his hands raw and scarred, shaking slightly. Elias waited for a test. He didn't have to wait long. The first small fires had been revelatory. The smoke, after a moment's hesitation, seemed to leap up the narrow throat, drawn with a quiet, decisive whoosh. There was no smoke in the room, none. The draught was immediate and powerful. He had held a candle near the fresh air inlet, and the flame had bent sideways, sucked toward the fire. The system was breathing. The fire itself was different. It was brighter, more active, the flames dancing, and the heat It was immediate. The angled walls glowed, projecting a wave of radiant warmth that pushed back the chill. Sarah, standing 10 feet away, could feel it on her face. "Elias," she'd said, her voice full of wonder, it's like standing in the sun." But the true trial, the test of the wind, came in mid-October. A storm, born in the northern Rockies, descended on the valley. It was a classic Wyoming gale, a horizontal scream of wind and ice-laced rain that turned to heavy, wet snow. This was the exact kind of weather that had nearly destroyed them before, the kind of night when the wind owned the chimney. Elias and Sarah sat in their cabin, the storm raging outside. The massive central chimney, which Elias had fed with a steady fire all afternoon, was now thrumming with heat. The stone tower was no longer a cold monolith. It was a warm, living presence. The entire cabin was filled with a stable, profound warmth. The granite hearthstone, once a block of ice, was now so hot they couldn't rest their feet on it for long. The wind hit the cabin, a physical blow that made the log walls creak. Elias tensed, his eyes fixed on the firebox. He was listening, waiting for the sound he dreaded, the hollow moan of the wind in the flue, the precursor to the downdraft. The wind shrieked, striking the chimney top with a violent, oscillating roar. And then it happened. A sound came from the flue, a sharp whoomp. It was the sound of a massive fist of cold air, traveling at 50 miles an hour, trying to force its way down. Elias flinched. The fire in the hearth flickered once, violently, then settled, burning as brightly as before. No smoke, not a wisp, not a trace. The downdraft, the wolf, had plummeted down the flue, struck the solid stone of the smoke shelf, and been deflected. Its energy, trapped and reversed, had nowhere to go but back up the chimney, adding its own force to the powerful updraft. The impossible trick had worked. The fireplace hadn't just resisted the wind, it had defeated it. Elias looked out the small, ice-caked window. He could just make out the dim light of Silas Croft's cabin, a quarter-mile distant. He saw a flicker, then another, and he knew, with a grim certainty, that Silas was fighting his fire, choking on smoke, perhaps already resigned to opening his door to the blizzard just to breathe. Here, inside their cabin, the air was still. It was warm. It was safe. Sarah put down her mending and came to put her hand on the warm stone of the chimney, far from the fire itself. "You did it, Elias," she whispered. "It's comfortable." Elias let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since that first night of smoke and failure. He had not just built a better chimney, he had built a new kind of survival. The morning after the storm, Silas Croft appeared at their door. He looked defeated. His face was smudged with soot, his eyes bloodshot. "Elias," he said, his voice a low rasp, "we spent half the night with the door open. The cabin's a wreck. Ash everywhere. Mary's sick from the smoke." He looked past Elias into the cabin, and his expression faltered. He was met not by a cloud of smoke, but by a wall of clean, radiant warmth. He stepped inside, looking around in disbelief. The air was clear. Young Jacob was playing on the floor. "My God, Elias," Silas said, walking toward the central stone tower. "You're burning a fire, but where's the smoke? How?" Elias Thorne, holding a cup of hot coffee, did not gloat. He picked up a piece of charcoal. For the second time, but now with the authority of proven success, he began to draw on a piece of split pine. He drew the shallow, splayed box. He drew the forward-leaning fire back, And most importantly, he drew the smoke shelf and the narrow, accelerated throat. "It's not about the size of the fire, Silas," Elias explained. "It's about the shape. It's about giving the smoke a fast path out and giving the wind no path in." Silas stared at the crude drawing for a long time. "A shelf," he said, rubbing his chin, "just a stone shelf." That spring, Silas Croft, with Elias's guidance, tore down his own chimney. The two men, working together, rebuilt it, this time as an interior chimney, its mass soaking up the heat. When other families began to arrive, staking new claims in the valley, they were faced with a choice: build the old way, as they'd been taught back east, or build this strange new thorn hearth. The proof was in the winters. The families who built the old, deep exterior fireplaces struggled. They burned massive quantities of wood. Their cabins were smoky and cold, and the wind terrorized them. The families who copied Elias's design, the central mass, the shallow box, the smoke shelf, found their lives transformed. Their cabins were warm, their air was clean, and they used, by some estimates, less than half the firewood. The design began to spread, carried by word of mouth, by sketches on letters sent back east, by teamsters and trappers who spent a warm night in a thorn-equipped cabin. It became the vernacular standard for the high-altitude plains. People built it without even knowing why it worked. "You put the shelf in," the instructions would go, "or the wind'll steal your fire." Decades later, new homes were still being built with a variation of that central stone core. The innovation had detached itself from its inventor. It was no longer one man's impossible trick. It had become the shared, anonymous wisdom of the region. It was the simple, practical, and life-saving answer to the question the wind had asked. Elias Thorne had not just warmed his own home. He had given an entire generation a tool for survival. What Elias Thorne had built, through trial, observation, and the shared wisdom of an old-world craftsman, was a nearly perfect machine for living. He had, with simple fieldstone and clay, intuitively mastered 4 distinct principles of thermal and fluid dynamics, principles that engineers and scientists would one day formally define. First, he had changed the method of heat transfer. The old fireplace was a convection oven. It heated air and immediately sucked that air up the chimney, pulling in cold air to replace it. Elias's new, shallow splayed firebox was a radiant heater. Like the sun, it transferred heat via infrared waves, which traveled through the air without heating it, instead warming the objects and people in the room directly. This was a profound leap in efficiency. Second, he had created thermal mass. By moving the chimney inside the cabin's insulated walls and building it as a massive, solid stone tower, he had created a thermal battery. The tons of stone absorbed the waste heat from the hot flue gases, heat that had previously been lost to the outside wind. All night long, after the fire had burned down to embers, that massive, warm stone column continued to radiate a gentle, even heat into the room, stabilizing the temperature and ending the brutal cycle of roasting and freezing. Third, he had mastered fluid dynamics. The combination of the smoke shelf and the narrow, smooth-walled throat was a work of frontier genius, a design Count Rumford was, at the same time, championing to the aristocrats of Europe. This design solved 2 problems. The shelf was a simple, physical barrier that deflected downdrafts. The narrow throat, acting as a venturi, forced the hot, buoyant gases to accelerate. This created a powerful, stable, laminar flow updraft that was simply too fast and too strong for the chaotic wind to reverse. And fourth, he had balanced the system. The small underground fresh air inlet was the final elegant piece. His fireplace no longer had to fight his house for air. It had its own dedicated breathing tube, leaving the warm air in the room unmolested. This single stroke eliminated the cold drafts that had plagued his old cabin. Elias Thorne, a farmer with a borrowed idea and calloused hands, had built a high-efficiency, passive heating, air-balanced system. He had confronted the physics of his environment, and instead of trying to overwhelm it with a bigger fire, had outsmarted it with a better design. He had understood that survival in a harsh land was not about brute force, but about a more intelligent, elegant cooperation with the laws of nature. Elias Thorne lived in that cabin for another 35 years. He and Sarah raised their son Jacob and then 2 daughters, neither of whom ever knew the sting of smoke in their eyes or the profound, biting cold of a failed hearth. The central stone chimney became the true heart of their home. It was the warm wall they leaned against on winter nights, the surface where they dried herbs and wet mittens, the center of their family's gravity. The great granite hearthstone, once a symbol of cold failure, became the warmest spot in the house, the favored place for the family dog and for grandchildren to sit. When Elias passed, an old man in a valley that was no longer a raw frontier, his design outlived him. The cabin itself was eventually replaced by a larger timber-framed house, but the Thorne hearth was built into its design, the principles now simply the way it was done. The common wisdom of Ohio had been replaced by the tested wisdom of Wyoming. Elias had learned what the wind already knew, that air is a river, and it must be guided, not fought. He learned what the stone knew, that heat is a thing to be held, to be stored and shared, not simply to be made and lost. He had looked at a failure not as a judgment, but as a problem of engineering. The common wisdom is only common. It is not always true. Sometimes survival depends on having the courage to tear down the very thing you were taught to build. A home is not just a shield we hide behind. It is a system for engaging with the world. Elias Thorne's fireplace worked because he stopped fighting the wind and instead built a new path for it. He learned to see the invisible currents that governed his world and to shape his world in harmony with them. The challenge, then and now, is not to make a bigger fire, but to build a smarter hearth, to understand the fundamental forces of nature, and to design a solution so well considered, so simple, and so effective that it fundamentally changes what it means to be safe, to be warm, and to be home.